And good morning. How's everyone doing? Welcome to Psychology 150. My name is Dr. Chris Roddenberry, coming to you live from the huge metropolis of Willow Springs, North Carolina, about a mile from the Lowe's grocery store, if anybody knows that. Welcome to my Psychology 150 class. I see we've got Angela Yang typing in the chat bar right now. Good morning to you, Angelina. Anyone else in the lecture is welcome to type in the chat bar. All you have to do is log into YouTube using your Gmail account, and you too can participate in the chat. Gus, good morning. Thanks for coming today. Eric, thank you very much for coming today. Holy cow, what a great class. Look at that. Nicholas, uh, Nicholas Valentino, Nicholas the Francoverse. Nadia, good to see you too. Wow, what a great class. Hi, Wang. Good to see you, Nicole. Is it Nicole or Wang? I'm not sure which one is your first name. It's good to see everybody. I got my coffee. I hope you have your coffee as well. Orientation. Oh, okay, Nicole. Fantastic. Cool. I was about to say, that's an interesting first name, Nicole. Good to see you. Orientation week is over. I wanted to make orientation week kind of slow because students are figuring the class out. I've got a lot of moving parts to the class. Students have to get their textbooks and all. So we are now ready to get started with chapter 1. So the chapter material is now, the quiz material is now in the books. I mean, in the on Blackboard. So if you want to work ahead a week, you are more than welcome to with the homeworks. The discussion boards don't happen. You can't do those ahead of time. But if you want to get ahead 1 week on the chapter quizzes, you're welcome to do that. So that's available. Anybody have any questions from orientation? If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat bar, and I will be more than happy to answer them. Don't forget, if you still don't have your textbook, the online textbook link that I provided you will give you the first 3 chapters of Psych 150 for free. So if you're still waiting on your textbook, no big deal. Use that link I've got, and you'll be able to see the first 3 chapters. All right, so we're talking about psychology here in this class. And so what I wanted to do today is just give you, let's see, where am I? I'm right here. I wanted to give you an appreciation for the world of psychology. So for chapter 1, we're just introducing psychology in its historical context, and then we're going to talk about what it means to be a psychologist and how psychology is practiced. And so today we're going to cover what psychologists do. We're going to talk about the founders of psychology, 3 famous psychologists, and then I'm going to talk about what we do in modern psychology. Okay? So that's today's lecture. And then on Thursday, I'm going to be covering the research aspect of psychology. Dadgummit. I hate it when it does that. Sorry about that. Got my screens messed up. I decided to type something in at the last moment. I do apologize. I'm supposed to have everything set up before class, but sometimes something hits my mind and I go ahead and type it right in the chat bar and it messes up my broadcast. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with psychology. Okay, so here we go. All right. Now, psychology is the scientific study of how humans think, feel, and behave. And this is recently with an emphasis on explaining how these functions are related to or controlled by the brain. The scientific study of how humans think, feel, and behave. So we're going to study everything from emotions to thought patterns to actual behavior. And we're going to focus on how these things can be tied back to this 3-pound lump of tissue that we have sitting on top of our neck. Now, what I want you to focus on is this idea of scientific, okay? Scientific. That one word in the definition is way more important than you would actually think, because scientific means something, okay? Now, here's the deal. You might say, well, gosh, people have been thinking about psychology and how humans feel for eons. And you know what? You would actually be right. So typically in most psychology classes, and you're going to see they tip their cap in your psych book here, they talk about Greek philosophers and how Greek philosophy was what we might call proto-psychology, actually, proto-psychology, proto-psychology. Okay, and what does that mean? Almost psychology. All right, now you might ask the question, why proto-psychology and not psychology? Well, here's the deal. These people reasoned about what it meant to think, what it meant to feel, what it meant to behave, but what they did not have was this aspect of science that we associate with psychology. Now, what is science? Science is measurement. So their philosophical approach, you know what the Greeks talked about what reality was, our ability to know it, and our limitations in terms of perceiving reality. They talked about whether or not we had a soul, what kind of volition and internal motivations that we had. You know, proto-psychologists, these Greek philosophers talked about how we remember things. But one of the things that they did not do was they did not back up their theories with measurement. Okay? So modern psychology is scientific. And by scientific, I mean that we focus on measuring things. We look for proof to back up our theories. Oh, my nose always itches when I'm on class. Okay? So you can think of psychology as a science as being relatively new. I like to tell my students psychology is the oldest discipline in the world, but it's the youngest science in the world. And this guy right underneath me is typically seen as the father of psychology. Now, you won't find him in your textbook until chapter 3, but really, if you look in the professional books on the history of psychology, what you're going to find is that Gustav Fechner is seen as the father of scientific psychology because he was the first one to prove that the mind could be measured. And he discovered this neat phenomenon he called the just noticeable difference. It turns out that there's a very mathematical and systematic relationship between the amount that things change and your ability to tell those to tell that thing is changing. He called this the just noticeable difference, the JND, and this was actually the first scientific demonstration of a scientific measure of the mind. He published a book in 1851 called The Elements of Psychophysiology. And so you can think of him as the quote father or progenitor of scientific psychology. Now, what I want you to know is that so psychology was born in the last half of the 19th century. From 1850 to 1900, psychology was in the process of being born. Now, I mentioned to you on the last slide that Gustav Fechner was very important as the father of scientific psychology, first to measure the mind. But your book is also going to talk about two other people in chapter 1, a fellow named Wilhelm Wundt and another German, and a fellow named William James. And both of these fellows have very important contributions to the field of psychology. Good morning, Wendy. Thanks for dropping in. We're just talking about the fathers of psychology. And I suggested that on the last slide there was a fellow named Gustav Fechner who was the first to prove that you could measure the mind. And then we have these two other guys. Now, your book is going to call Wilhelm Wundt the father of psychology. You know what? Sure, why not? He's important in that he opened the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. Before Wilhelm Wundt, you could not you couldn't have the title of Doctor of Psychology. You couldn't be a psychologist, a professional psychologist. But he opened this lab in 1879 and started handing out the first PhDs in psychology. And his students would be the first generation of scientific psychologists to populate colleges and universities around the world, especially in America. And if you look at this picture over here, I've got this picture of different colleges in the United States, and you'll see all of these East Coast colleges in the late 19th century. And these were all psychology departments that were founded with Gustav Fechner's students during the last half of the 19th century. So as you can see, Wilhelm Wundt sort of created the first generation of psychologists that would begin studying how humans think, feel, and behave. And then you got this guy down here, let me point this way, named William James. He was a Harvard psychologist. Okay, so Wilhelm Wundt and Gustav Fechner were both German guys. This fellow named William James was actually a Harvard philosopher who dabbled in psychology. And he wrote a textbook, The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. And this would, A, be the first psychology text to be used in these psych classes over here. And it also provided a roadmap for what psychology should study during the 20th century. So as when you look through chapter 1, you're going to see these two fellows mentioned. And I want you on the exam to know each's major contribution to the field of psychology. And then I want you to know about this guy named Gustav Fechner, who's not included in your textbook. You know what, real quick, so what you might want to know is, let's see, Fechner, first to measure mind. Wundt, first lab. And James, first textbook. I will ask you to know these things on the first exam, so go ahead and write those down. Okay, so here we go. Boom, back to this. Oh, let's see. All right, here we go. William Wundt, William James. Okay, fantastic. Now, here's the deal. Actually, quickly tell me, why don't doctors, medical doctors, specialize in all the body parts? Why do we have cardiologists and neurologists and OBGYN? Why don't we have doctors that specialize in all of these activities? Can anybody type in the chat bar and let me know why we don't have doctors who specialize in all of these fields? Quick. Why don't we? Interesting. Why can't you go to the neurologist who also does heart surgery? Chris, I wonder why. Can somebody type in the chat bar and let me know? Why don't we have people who specialize in being heart surgeons and OBGYNs? If you think about it, that would be too much knowledge for one person to have. It's too difficult. If you think about studying human beings and you ask the question, why do people do things? There are many different answers. So, why did my boyfriend break up with me? Why did my boss fire me? Why do people cry when they get sad? These are really big, difficult questions that have many different kinds of answers. So what you're going to find in the development of psychology during the first 50 to 75 years of the history, from let's say 1900 to 1925, there were different approaches. There were, in a sense, different ideas about how we should study human beings. The first two approaches come from these fathers that I mentioned on the last slide, Wilhelm Wundt and William James. And so Wilhelm Wundt thought it was important that we study and try to figure out how the mind is organized. What are the parts of our memory? What are the parts of our emotions? What are the parts that make up these things we call our psychological experience? So he was what we would call a structuralist. So he might ask the question, how many different personality traits do you need to describe the average person? So do you see how he sort of focused on the structure of what personality looks like? On the other hand, this guy named William James thought that that wasn't so important. He said, you know what, instead of trying to draw a picture of what the mind looks like, let's instead focus on what the mind helps us do. So, how does the mind impact the functions of our behavior and thinking? So, he was a functionalist. So instead of asking how many different personality traits do you need to describe the average person, he would probably ask the question, how does your personality affect your ability to maintain a romantic relationship? He was sort of a functionalist, if you will. And so these were just two ways of studying the human being. Do you want to try to describe what the mind looks like, all of its parts? Or instead, do you want to talk about what the mind helps us do? And so, sort of the first division in psychology was to try and decide, should we study what the mind looks like or what it helps us do? These were sort of, if you will, approaches to psychology. Now, what happened was, as people became more interested in studying the mind and psychological functioning, people began to have different approaches, find different things important about studying human psychological functioning. And what you're going to see is that over the second 50 years in the history of psychology, from 1900 to 1950, we developed, I guess, what you might call approaches, different angles of looking at how people's psychological functioning occurs. And you're actually even going to see this chart in your book, Table 1.1. And you'll notice that the first two approaches were structuralism and functionalism. The first division in opinion on how to study the human being came with Wundt and James. Wundt said we need to draw a picture of what the mind looks like, and William James said no, we need to study what the mind helps us do. So those were two different approaches to studying the human being. And what you're going to see over the next 50 years, several other different approaches to psychology developed. The Gestalt approach, the behavioristic approach, the humanistic approach, and the cognitive approach. Now, we're going to cover all of these approaches at some point during this semester, but I'm going to focus on three of these approaches in chapter 1 because they're featured heavily in chapter 1 and they have important historical figures that you as a psychology student need to know. So we're going to focus on three important psychologists and their approaches to psychology: Sigmund Freud and the analytic approach, John Watson and the behaviorist approach, and George Miller and the cognitive approach. Okay, now this fellow underneath me, Sigmund Freud. Has anybody ever actually heard of Sigmund Freud before? He is so famous that people who aren't even psychologists have heard his name. I'd like to call him the first rock star psychologist. If you've heard of him, there we go. Angelina Yang has heard of him. Fantastic. And I'll bet several of you have heard of him. Angelina Yang, he was the first super duper world famous psychologist. He published a book in 1899 called The Interpretation of Dreams, right? And he developed this theory he called psychoanalytic theory, where he argued, there we go, everybody's heard of Sigmund Freud, Abs, and Angelina, and even has a couple of his books. Okay, fantastic. All right, so what he suggested is that human beings, if you want to really know about a human being, you have to understand the conflicts that have occurred in their life. So, how many of you ever had something that was traumatic or bad or embarrassing happen to you long time ago that still affects your personality? Have any of you ever dated a person or been close to a person who was traumatized as a 2 or 3 year old, who was maybe abused by their parents, not treating well, or sexually abused, or something like that? Sigmund Freud thought that if you really, really wanted to know people, if you really wanted to explain people's behavior, you had to go back and look at the trauma that occurred in their life. And he focused on the trauma that occurred during the first 5 years of our life. That's when he really was interested in human beings. And he argued that we all go through this pretty typical traumatic process as we begin to develop our feelings, our adult sexual feelings. So he argued that sexuality and the conflict and trauma around sexual behavior and sexual thoughts was important in understanding people's behavior. Now, we're going to talk about him more in chapter 13, but he came up with some terms to describe personality that you may be familiar with. He argued that sometimes people are so embarrassed about the things that happen to them. The things that happen to them are so bad that they can't deal with these things and they have to sort of rearrange their feelings about these. He called this process of rearranging our feelings, he called these defense mechanisms. Sometimes things happen that are so traumatic to people that they forget about them. He argued that sometimes people repress traumatic memories. Have any of you ever heard of repressed memories? People who were maybe abused as kids and they went to a therapist as an adult and they discovered these memories that they had been hiding all of their life. In a sense, what Sigmund Freud argued is that they were using the defense mechanism of repression. So these people, hi Pete, how are you doing? I'm actually in lecture right now with 15 of the most amazing, intellectually smart psychology students. So I'll get back to you in about 2 hours. Okay, bud? Thanks. Okay, so he focused on defense mechanisms and the way that people hide themselves from trauma. And so he talked about repression. Sometimes people forget the things that make them embarrassed or feel bad about themselves. Have any of you ever dated a person who accused you of cheating on them and then it turns out later that they were cheating on you? Maybe their guilt was causing them to think that you were cheating on them. And he called this defense mechanism projection. And he had this whole list of defense mechanisms, including repression, projection, displacement, sublimation. And basically, Sigmund Freud said if you really want to understand a human being, you have to go back and look at the trauma that occurred to them early in life. That's one way of approaching people. So let's think about this. Wilhelm Wundt said, you know what, if you want to learn about human psychology, you need to find out what the different parts of the brain and the mind look like. You need to figure out the structure of the mind. William James said, oh, no, 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 no. Really, it's not. It's more important to find out what the mind helps us do. And Sigmund Freud said, you know what, I kind of agree with William James, but I think the most important mechanism, the most important function that the mind engages in is in protecting us from thoughts that make us feel embarrassed or anxious. And so these are three different approaches to studying the human being. Okay, now there's a fellow named John Watson who's also super duper famous in psychology. You may not have heard of him, but I'll bet you heard of a fellow who was influenced by him named B.F. Skinner. Anybody in class ever heard of B.F. Skinner? Very, very famous psychologist. And B.F. Skinner was famous for studying pigeons and rats. Okay? And these fellows were known together as behaviorists. Have any of you ever trained a dog to sit or to shake hands or to pee outside? Have any of you ever, do any of you have children and you've taught your children? You maybe have spanked your children. Have any of you had these experiences? If you have, you have used behavioristic techniques. So, the second big approach in the 20th century to studying human beings was to look at how the environment shapes or changes our behavior. Now, these people disagreed with Sigmund Freud, and really all of these different approaches to psychology were built because each psychologist would disagree with the way the other psychologist was studying the human being. John Watson and his colleagues said, you know what? You shouldn't focus on people's internal conflicts and what's going on in their mind. Really, all you need to know is what's happening in their environment. And if you look at their behavior, you can see how their behavior is changed by their environment. And so John Watson and B.F. Skinner and their colleagues demonstrated the power of the environment to change people's behavior. John Watson is super duper famous. He used this technique called classical conditioning to create a phobia in a 2-year-old child. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 6 it is. We're going to talk about it in great detail. But this guy, John Watson, was the first to demonstrate how phobias occur. Do any of you have a phobia? Any of you ever heard of somebody with agoraphobia, claustrophobia, arachnophobia, coulrophobia? If you have a phobia or if you have anxiety, chances are you learned it from your environment. And the behaviorists were very interested in how the environment could cause these fear responses. Now, we're going to compare that with a guy named B.F. Skinner. He was the first guy to understand and explain the process by which you can teach a dog to sit or shake hands. If any of you have ever been to SeaWorld or the circus and seen animals perform tricks, those animals have been taught to do those tricks using a form of conditioning, of teaching, known as operant conditioning. And they, just like you train a dog to sit by using dog treats, you can train a porpoise or an orca whale or any other animal to do tricks using treats. Now, the interesting thing about this is B.F. Skinner and his buddies thought that you learned everything you do using this same procedure. So, you know you have a vocabulary and you know how to talk. They would argue that you learned how to talk by being given rewards. You know how to read, you know how to play baseball, you know how to walk. Every behavior you have learned, they would argue you learned from your environment. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the term nature versus nurture. Anybody ever heard that term? Nature versus nurture? Let's see, where are we going? Nature versus nurture. Behaviorists. Behaviorists. Behaviorists were naturists, were nurturists. Behaviorists were extreme nurturists. They did not believe that there was anything unique about you, internal to you, that affected who you were. According to them, it all depended upon your environment. So that's what these behaviorists would have said, okay? Now, so we've got these different approaches to psychology. We've got the functionalists, the structuralists, who say, really, you need to measure what the mind looks like. The functionalists said, no, you need to focus on what the mind can help us do. Then Sigmund Freud said, you know what? William James is kind of right. Let's talk about the psychological conflicts and the effect that trauma has on our behavior. And the behavior said, well, you know what? Trauma, yes, but really you can think about the environment more generally, and the environment in general shapes who we are. Now, this fellow named George Miller, who we're not going to, he's not quite as famous as the other psychologists, so that's why I don't have his name up there. But George Miller was the first cognitive psychologist, and these folks took the idea of the computer and applied it to human beings. And they said, you know what? Human minds, if you will, are just like computers. They process information. And so the cognitive approach was inspired by the invention of the first computers. And these people asked the question, do humans process information just like computers? And it turns out there are a bunch of similarities between humans and computers, and there are also some differences in the way human beings and computers process information. In fact, probably the neat thing, what George Miller's most famous for, is this thing called Miller's magic number. It turns out if I give you a list of vocabulary words to remember, if I give you a list of groceries to pick up at this grocery store and I read them to you over the phone and you can't write them down, what this guy George Miller found is that for the most part, most people can remember about 7 plus or minus 2 grocery items. This became known as Miller's magic number. And in fact, modern IQ tests measure Miller's magic number as a part of their IQ evaluation. Because some of you, remember Miller's magic number is an average, some of you have a better short-term memory than do other people, right? And so he represents what we'll call the cognitive approach. Now you look down at the bottom of this slide and you'll see I have the word cognitive neuroscience. In 1950, when George Miller first published his work, computers didn't exist, nuclear technology didn't exist. We could not see inside the human brain, and nobody really had any idea what was going on inside the mind. Now, jump ahead 70 years to the year 2020. We actually have all these really cool technologies and tools that allow us to measure and see what's going on inside the brain. So the newest form of cognitive psychology is called cognitive neuroscience. And these people are using modern technology to try and explain what's actually going on in the brain as you are thinking. Okay, so let me scroll back really quick just to give you an appreciation of what we're talking about. For those of you who just got here, if you look at this table, it's in your textbook. And these schools of thought represent different ways of studying this complex thing called a human being. And what I want you to appreciate is over the first probably 100 years of psychology, from 1850 to 1950, people were trying to figure out what's the best way to understand how human beings think, feel, and behave. And these schools of thought represent different psychologists and their attempts to describe the best way to study human beings. So let's scroll over. I want you to know Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalytic approach. I want you to know John Watson and the behavioral approach. I want you to understand George Miller and the cognitive approach. Okay. And so I want you to be able to appreciate these different psychologists and how they impacted the development of psychology. On your homework and on your exam, I reserve the right to ask you about any of these 5 psychologists, 6 psychologists. I'm going to ask you maybe about Gustav Fechner, Wilhelm Wundt, William James, the first 3 fathers of psychology. Then I might ask you about Sigmund Freud, George Miller, or B.F. Skinner. So I want you to know these names. As a psychology student, you should be familiar with these psychologists, okay? Now, don't worry if you can't remember all these psychologist names right now. By the time we get to the end of this semester, you will have heard these psychologist names so many times that you will be familiar with them. And that's part of what it means to have to call yourself a psychology student, is that you will appreciate and know who these different figures are. Now, there's also in chapter 1, there is this other table, table 1.2, And this organizes and demonstrates these subfields of psychology. This is kind of confusing, but I want to talk to you about it. Right after World War II, right after World War II, um, before World War II, you could go get a PhD in psychology, and that made you able to do whatever you wanted. You could get a PhD in psychology and you could treat people with psychological disorders, or you could study memory, or you could cut open human brains and study those brains. But the thing was, there was no official organization in the field. But after World War II, all of the soldiers coming back had PTSD, or not all of them, excuse me. A ton of PSD really emerged as a public problem, a social problem in the United States from all the soldiers coming back from World War II. And psychologists quickly realized that if they were going to treat these people, they needed to be much more professional in their approach to the study of human psychology. And so what happened after 1944 was this thing called the American Psychological Association was developed. And you see I've got the website right here you should be looking at. Hopefully it's on your screen. And basically the APA became a professional organization that organized the study of psychology. And so the APA decided that it would be very important if we organized the study of psychology into sort of these different professional groups. And these became known as the subfields of psychology. Now, here's the deal. When you go to become a psychologist these days, okay, you can't just go get a PhD in psychology. Instead, you have to choose a specific subfield of psychology. So just like you have to be, if you decide to specialize in psychology or in a medical field, you become, actually you have to specialize in every, even if you want to be a general practitioner in the medical field, that's a specialty. But if you think about it, the medical field has cardiologists, pediatricians, general practitioners, OBGYNs, neurologists. You see how in the medical field you have different areas of specialization? In the field of psychology, we have different areas of specialization. So I'm not just a psychologist, but if you look on this chart over here, you'll see that there is a subfield called social psychology. I am a social psychologist. That means my expertise is in understanding how groups perform, how groups interact, and how people behave in groups. That's where I am an absolute expert. And when we get to chapter 12, social psychology, you will be in the area of my expertise. Now, a lot of people, when they meet me for the first time and find out I'm a psychologist, immediately think I can help them with their problems. But you know what? I am not trained to help people with their psychological problems. In fact, I know just a little bit more than you do about helping people with their psychological problems because I was not trained in clinical psychology. And if you see in the bottom of the chart right down here, there's a subfield called clinical psychology. And if you go to a graduate school for clinical psychology, you will spend 5 years learning about psychological disorders and how to treat them. I went to a social psychological program, so I spent 5 years learning how groups interact and how people interact in groups. So each of these areas is a specific professional designation that you can get as a psychologist. So if any of you find this class wonderfully interesting and you decide to be a psych major and you like your psych major so much that you decide to go to graduate school, when it comes time from graduate school, you will have to pick the program that you go to. All right. Now, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is where I did my schooling, and that's the only reason I'm talking about it, you state fans. We have, I believe it's 7 different subfields that you can get a PhD in. Okay, we have a biopsych program at UNC Chapel. We have a cognitive program at UNC Chapel Hill. There's a developmental program at UNC Chapel Hill. There's a personality program at UNC Chapel Hill. There's a social psych program at Chapel Hill. There's a clinical psych program at Chapel Hill. That's 4. And there is something that's not even listed on here. There's a quantitative psychology program at Chapel Hill. And these are the different PhD designations you can get. And you don't apply, when you go to graduate school, you don't apply to the university, you actually apply to the program. So when I applied to UNC Chapel Hill, I didn't apply to Carolina. I didn't apply to the psych program. I applied to the social program located on the 3rd floor of the psych building. And me and 5 other students were selected and entered the program in the fall of 1994. And so about every year, our psych program admits 4 to 6 students in that program. Does that make every sense to everybody? And so what I want you to know is these different subfields and what these subfields are interested in. Now, the neat thing about this, or the important thing about this, is I'm going to ask you about this on your final exam. Here we are, the first day of class, and I'm already telling you to mark a page in your notes as being relevant for the final exam. On your final exam, I will expect you to be able to identify examples of each of these subfields of psychology. And in fact, over the course of the semester, each chapter is going to relate to a different area of psychology, or subfield, if you will. So for chapter 2, we're going to talk about biopsychology and how the brain and your nerves and neurons and the chemicals in your brain affect your behavior. We're going to talk about the subspecialty of biopsychology next week in chapter 2. Okay? When we get to chapter 7, we're going to talk about cognitive psychology. We're going to talk about your memory, how you remember things, how you process information, and your ability to do calculations. We're going to talk about that with cognitive neuroscience. When we get to chapter 4, developmental psychology, we're going to talk about how people mature and grow. How does your personality unfold as you get older? How do your mental abilities begin to unfold as you get older? We're going to talk about that in chapter 4. When we get to chapter 13, we're going to talk about personality psychology. And I'm going to talk about how we measure people's personality. And we're going to take some personality tests. And I'm going to help you learn about yourself by taking personality tests. Okay? When we get to chapter 14 and 15, we're going to talk about clinical psychology. I'm going to talk about psychological disorders, what they are, how many different psychological disorders there are, how we evaluate people and diagnose psychological disorders, and how we treat psychological disorders. That's all going to occur in the clinical psychology chapters 14 and 15. When we get to chapter 12, social psychology, again, I'm going to talk to you about how groups behave and how people behave within groups. That's what we call social psychology. All right. And so these are all some of the different areas of specialization. Now, I'm going to point out to you the one at the bottom, industrial organizational psychology. If NC State's psychology department was created a few years after UNC Chapel Hill's psychology department. And the people at NC State were absolutely brilliant. They said instead of competing for students with the University of North Carolina, let's engage in training them in different areas of specialization. So, if you want to go to NC State University's psychology graduate program, you can't get a PhD in clinical psychology. NC State does not have a clinical psych program. However, if you want to get an industrial psychology degree, you can't go to UNC Chapel Hill. You have to go to NC State because they have that area of specialization. So, industrial and organizational psychology is the psychology that is interested in how people function at the workplace. So, how can we make our employees happier and hopefully more effective and more productive, right? And so, IO psychologists have discovered that if you put employee owner on the name tag, people are less likely to steal from the business because it makes them think that they are actually stealing from themselves. And who steals from themselves, right? IO psychologists also know that instead of giving raises, you can have an employee of the month parking space, and that will motivate your employees. And so, industrial and organizational psychologists are interested in understanding how psychology works in the business place. Okay? Now, these are different areas of specialization. Now, I haven't gone over all of these. I just talked about some of the ones that you're going to find in our textbook and the one that you see at UNC Chapel Hill and NC State. However, for the first exam and also for the final exam, you need to be able to tell me what each of these type of psychologists does. What do they study? What are they interested in? And what I will do, the way I do this, is I'll give you examples I will give you examples of psychology studies, and I will ask you to tell me what area of specialization would be interested in this. For example, let me give you an example. How about this? This is an article that I just found today. If you look at it, it's from the Henry Ford Health Center. Did you know? Did you know that TikTok is giving teenage girls tics? There's a huge increase in the number of tic-related disorders. I don't know if you've ever heard of Tourette's syndrome. That's a tic-related disorders. It turns out that psychologists have begun to notice that females, especially teenage girls, are extremely affected by TikTok, and they've been developing this tic disorders. Now, looking at this article, what kind of psychologist do you think would be interested in this particular question? Let's go back to the PowerPoint that we're in. Okay, so now I just went back to the PowerPoint. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I forgot to take that off. Let's go back. I had my thing here. Let's see. Go back to my PowerPoint presentation. There you go. Do you see this? Why is TikTok giving teenage girls? Why is TikTok giving? Oh, I messed that up. Why is TikTok giving teenage girls tics? Do you see this article right here? Now, think about it. Why? What kind of psychologist would be interested in this particular technology? So let's. Oh, crap. I'm using the wrong. Let's see. Where's my power? That's the one I wanted, my PowerPoint, sharing my PowerPoint. Why is TikTok giving teenage girls? So, if you would, look at the areas of specialization. Can somebody tell me which area of specialization would be interested in understanding how girls get tic disorders from TikTok? See that article? Can somebody tell me? Anybody who's still in class? I see we have 14 people. By the way, I want to really thank you. The turnout for today's class was absolutely amazing. What do you think? Which subfield would be most interested in the effect that the internet has on girls getting this particular psychological disorder? Does everybody understand the question? This is the kind of question that I'm going to ask you. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to say, hey, Dr. Smith is interested in cultural, okay, 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 evolutionary, health psychologist. What about clinical psychology? I could see where you're talking about health, Jordan, because you're talking about how the person, typically with health psychology, we focus on how we can help people engage in health related behaviors, how I can help you quit smoking, how I can help you stay off drugs, how I can help you beat stress. That's where your health psychologists are interested in. Cultural psychologists are kind of interested in how our culture affects our behavior. So, how men are different from women, how minorities are affected by culture. So, those are right. But clinical would be good. Evolutionary, that's kind of interesting. When you come to webinar on Thursday night, Angelina, if you want to talk about that, I'd be curious in getting your opinion on why you think it's evolutionary. Right. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you examples like this, and you're going to have to tell me what area of specialty is most appropriate. Does that make sense to everybody? And before we leave, last couple of seconds, I know you folks have got to get to we've got to, let's see. There we go. Number lock. There we go. Okay. So where do you find psychologists? Now, if you look down here, the one thing you'll know is that all these different areas of specialization do different kinds of jobs. Now, most people think that all psychologists are clinical psychologists and work in hospitals or health services. You know what? Some of them are. About 25% of the psychologists you meet are going to be clinical psychologists working in hospitals, right? But 25% of your psychologists are going to be like me, academics that you'll find in college settings. All right. Now, you'll then find clinical psychologists everywhere. Some of them work in medical centers, some of them work for businesses. You know what? You're going to find school psychologists if you are having if you have a learning disorder or some other behavioral problem in college, in high school, or in grade school, they'll send you to a school psychologist, right? And you're going to find all kinds of different psychologists in different areas. What I want you to understand from this particular chart is that 25% of your psychologists are clinical psychologists, not 100%. And I want you to know the difference between what we call basic research and applied psychology. I'm a scientist, I work in a college setting, and I am one of the persons that tries to figure out how the mind works by doing experiments and research studies, okay? And so university and college psychologists do research studies. But the rest of these psychologists take what we know, what we learn from the labs, and they apply it to helping people have better lives. So clinical psychologists take what we've learned from research studies and they treat people suffering from psychological disorders. Business IO psychologists take what we've learned from research settings and they apply it in the business world. So I want you to know the difference between business and applied psychology, and I want you to know about clinical psychology. Okay, I see I'm losing some people right now. I know we're getting close to the witching hour. 4 people have dropped off, so it's probably time for me to end this lecture. Hey, you folks have a great day. It was great to see everybody. I'm super excited for you to come. Thank you very much. I hope to see you on Thursday morning when we talk about research methods in psychology, and then Thursday night when we have our webinar. You folks have a great day. Take care, and I will see you on Thursday. Bye.